If we were to rattle off a list of names associated with Final Fantasy, a few names are sure to spring to mind. Hironobu Sakaguchi, Tetsuya Nomura, Yoshinori Kitase, Kazushige Najima, perhaps even Yoshi P, Nobu Uematsu, Yoshitaka Amano, and yet, less remarked upon, though equally long-standing in his association with the series, is the long-serving Squaresoft veteran, Hiroyuki Ito. Now, Final Fantasy is a series that is largely regarded for its unique stories and characters. Cloud Strife battling Sephiroth, Lady Yuna's pilgrimage, the returners fighting against Kefka. These are the elements of the games that most audiences remember and enjoy, the emotive, narrative heart of the experience that compels us to play. Yet, it is also a series of unique systems, with each game boasting a drum-tight architecture of interwoven mechanics and components that make up the fundamentals of combat and levelling that is so essential to the progression aspect of the RPG experience. And it is here that Hiroyuki Ito has made his mark, if a little more subtly than others, across the anthology of the Final Fantasy games. Beginning at the beginning, and looking at Ito's tenure at Square, it is typical of the personnel that we've already discussed on the channel, with Tetsuya Nomura, for example, progressing from debugging and graphical assets to a full-blown character designer and director in his own right. Likewise, Ito began his career as something of an everyman, working as a debugger on the first two Final Fantasy games, contributing to sound design on the third game, before moving into what we'd reasonably consider his forte of systems design in Final Fantasy IV, and here he inherited the turn-based battle systems and the formula by Akitoshi Kawauzu, and evolved the experience of Final Fantasy as an RPG by developing the Active Time Battle, or ATB system, for Final Fantasy IV. Now, just to clarify, the ATB system was, on the surface, quite a simplistic mechanic, giving each character and enemy an internal personal timer which dictated their turn and their speed in battle. But what this did is add much more strategy and opportunity to the battling system in Final Fantasy, and rather than the old attritional JRPG games where you attack and then the enemy attacks and it's basically down to who dies first, the ATB system was advantageous in giving individual characters with specific stats and buffs the potential to have multiple turns. It gave spells like slow and haste and stop much more purpose, and it gave the opportunity to level abilities and level characters to assist in some part to their speed in battle. More broadly than that, and I suppose a more subjective point, I think the creation of the ATB system gave Final Fantasy games a very unique rhythm and elegance to combat that is very distinct from both the clunkiness of pure turn-based mechanics and the chaos of action gameplay. And much like the pre-rendered backgrounds that immortalised the PS1 era Final Fantasy titles as this historic moment between tile-based formats and 3D environments, Hiroyuki Ito's ATB system occupies a historic niche before the push into the full action-based gameplay that we see today. Such was the excitement around Ito's invention that Squaresoft immediately filed patents for the mechanic in both Japan and USA, ensuring that the ATB system could only be utilised by the team that invented it, and primarily for Final Fantasy games, and this was a huge boon for Ito's repute within the company. His next role was, again, building on the work of his predecessors, this time in Final Fantasy V, by working with other game designers to evolve the job class system, which first debuted in Final Fantasy III, adding to its malleability and its use within the restrictions of a battle system. Something he also did more radically, I think, in Final Fantasy Tactics down the line. So these successive developments by Ito in this period of the early 90s, late 80s, led to his elevation and his co-direction of Final Fantasy VI alongside Yoshinori Kitase, and you can almost picture how this relationship synergized so well towards the success that Final Fantasy VI was, because we have one, Kitase, focusing on the world and story and his aptitudes there, And then we have Ito, the other, taking these principles and weaving them credibly into a battle system that complements and reflects back the world and the characters that we're playing as. And this is, I think, as much, if not more so, than developing the ATB system in the first place, what makes Hiroyuki Ito such a significant player in Final Fantasy's success. Because looking at successive games that he has designed battle systems for, whether it's Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy VI, to Final Fantasy Tactics, which was a hugely unique contribution to the series in how it approached battles and systems, and particularly the job systems, as I've touched on. And then we have games like Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy XII, which were slightly more controversial than others, in no small part owing to how they approached and implemented battle and levelling. But all of these, including 8 and 12, were very attentive to the world and story they were operating in, and how that informed and reflected in the respective systems that were designed and used there. So for example, Final Fantasy VIII uses the somewhat controversial Junction System, which is relied on to use magic and summons in this game. But looking to the setting of Final Fantasy VIII, the entire premise of the world is that only a handful of deities can actually harness magic. So we have sorceresses, we have the summons, the guardian forces, which is very much the backbone of the core story of that game. And so having GFs as a necessity for using magic in battle, it makes perfect sense. And I suppose that being said, the draw system, which is a byproduct of the Junction System, is also heavily criticised as a means of obtaining magic in the first place in Final Fantasy VIII. And I do kind of get that, but at the same time, while it is criticised for being quite a laborious process, our GFs can learn abilities to refine a lot of magic from items in this game, which circumvents the need for a lot of the laborious draw system, in my opinion, once you're a couple of hours in. And the same goes for the controversial enemies levelling alongside your party in this game, because if you're using the Junction System in an appropriate way, which is to artificially buff your party's stats irrespective of their level, then none of this is particularly an issue, and it's actually a mechanic and a part of the strategy of Final Fantasy VIII. But that's by the by. I've discussed the Junction System in other episodes. My point here is simply Ito's attentiveness to crafting mechanics that appropriately reflect the world is one of his key strengths, and I think contributes hugely, though it's not appreciated as much as the storytelling and the characters and whatnot, but it is in its own way a huge contribution to the success of these games. Following Final Fantasy VIII, Ito was chosen to direct Final Fantasy IX, and once more we have a great collaboration between a story-driven creative like Hironobu Sakaguchi and a systems planner like Ito, creating this unique and celebratory, I think, entry to the Final Fantasy games, which was a retrospective look back to earlier systems, earlier conventions, such as character classes, ATB mechanics, like we saw in Final Fantasy IV. But beyond this, Ito also contributes some of my personal favourite mechanics to Final Fantasy IX and the broader anthology, such as the active time event system, and it provided optional, non-essential narrative breakaways to see what other major and minor characters were doing in a given town or scenario. And I loved this. It contributed hugely to world building and character development in a very focused sort of slice of life, snapshot sort of way, and I would really love for them to return to something that nodded back to the active time event system. I thought that was really great from a world building storytelling perspective. And Ito also designed both Tetramaster and Triple Triad, the card games for Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy IX, which were generally well regarded, but again I think it's just a testament to his very sort of strategy systems based mindset and skill set, how he comes up with these little curios, big and small, across the games. Following Final Fantasy IX, Ito inherited his last major Final Fantasy project to date by directing Final Fantasy XII, and this was taken up after the all-round creator of the e-release Final Fantasy games, Yasumi Matsuno, left the project quite abruptly due to stress. And we should bear in mind here that this is kind of 2004, 2005, when things were really hitting the fan post-merger at Square Enix. Hironobu Sakaguchi had left. A lot of Square veterans and staff were leaving with him to join Mistwalker, Sakaguchi's studio. So I think Ito was well placed as a veteran since the very first game to replace Matsuno. I've done a very lengthy review / defense on Final Fantasy XII already on the channel a few years ago, and yeah, I really advocate for that game, despite the mixed reception it got. And looking purely here at the battle system design, we can see how Ito continued to innovate within the confines of both ATB systems and the setting of game worlds by toying with AI-controlled party members via the Gambit system in 12, and using a very ambitious, classless, completely customizable character system and leveling system with the licenses in Final Fantasy XII. So generally made something that gave the player, for the first time, complete control over how their party leveled and acted within the game world. So very novel approach there, which was actually tweaked for the Zodiac Age, which a lot of people preferred that approach. But I really liked the innovations that he pushed for in Final Fantasy XII. So wrapping up on this brief glimpse at Hiroyuki Ito's career, I think the most telling and appropriate tribute to him, perhaps, is the latest game that he has developed and directed, which is the appropriately titled Dungeon Encounters, which was released in 2021, because this is a very subtle yet deeply layered RPG, styled in its own way after the ATB system, which he developed all those years ago. And indeed, it basically is purely the ATB system is the means and the heart of the gameplay there, because it's very sparse on story. In fact, it's safe to say it's broadly non-story. It has a very mechanics-driven approach, both in terms of its aesthetic, the UI, the gameplay, and all round it's a testament, I think, in a very bare-bones, function-driven form, to the innovations and approach of this battle systems designer, who has been so consistent yet understated in how critical to the success of the Final Fantasy series he has been.